We're going to be spending a little bit more time in the Old Testament today. We were in the Old Testament last week. But the Old Testament gets kind of a bad rap sometimes. There's some lengthy stretches that aren't at all interesting to read, let's be honest. And it's often a less relatable part of the Bible than the New Testament. In fact, sometimes it can be difficult to reconcile the Old Testament with New Testament sensibilities. Of course, a lot of the criticism leveled at the Bible in general, and particularly at the Old Testament, arises primarily out of ignorance. Biologist and ethologist Richard Dawkins, a man whose arrogance and ignorance exceeds his intelligence, wrote this in his book, The God Delusion. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. All that Dr. Dawkins demonstrates in this quote is his thoroughgoing ignorance of the Bible. With time and study, I could address the problems with every one of those accusations against the God of the Old Testament. But since we're in a series about women right now, let's talk about that accusation of misogyny, a word that literally means the hatred of women. Last week, we began a series called The Daughters of Eve, in which we're taking a fresh look at passages in the Bible that have historically been interpreted patriarchally. That is, they've been interpreted primarily by men without a thought for how women might view it or how women might be affected by it. Last week, we saw how men and women were created as equal partners. They were created as co-rulers of the earth who shared the responsibility to represent God's reign on the earth. We also saw sin enter into the world, leading to estrangement and competition between the sexes. In the generations that followed that fall from grace, that entry of sin into the world, men would begin treating women like property, like possessions. They would be valued not as equal bearers of the image of God, but rather as objects of beauty whose purposes were limited to men's pleasure and to bearing their children. Women, meanwhile, had to depend on men for survival, so they came to embrace this arrangement out of necessity. This was the rise of patriarchy. And then around 3,500 years ago, after innumerable generations of patriarchy becoming an entrenched part of human culture, God sets aside a group of people to be his people. He rescues them from slavery. He establishes a special relationship with them. He helps them build a society that will represent him and what he stood for generations to come. To that end, through the prophet Moses, God gave these people, the Israelites, laws by which to govern themselves. Now, there is a perception that these laws support patriarchy. And to be sure, compared to our modern expectations, some of them might seem a bit backwards. But keep in mind how far humanity had fallen from what God made them to be. If God were to bring us back to where he wanted us, it was going to have to happen by steps and stages. This is just the first stage. And when you contrast these laws with those of other cultures at the time, they were actually pretty progressive. For one thing, throughout the law, you see language specifically protecting both men and women. In the Ten Commandments alone, we have several examples. First, there's the law about the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, sons and daughters, male and female servants are to rest on the Sabbath. Now, in most modern translations where gender neutrality is implied, scholars translate appropriately. There are several places in the New Testament that in the original text just say brothers, but it implies both men and women, so modern translators render it brothers and sisters. But I looked at the original Hebrew here, and that's not what's happening in this passage. The original Hebrew specifically names both males and females as being protected by this law. This isn't just culturally sensitive translation. This is a fully accurate rendering of the original text. And that's not the only place we see the law of Moses provide protections for both men and women specifically by name. The Israelites are commanded to honor both their fathers and their mothers. Both men and women are forbidden to commit adultery. In fact, the law specifically says that both the man and the woman would be punished for adultery, not just one or the other. Children could be punished for attacking or cursing either their fathers or mothers. In at least 3 different places in the law, slave owners were held accountable for the long-term well-being of both their male and female slaves. Restitution had to be made if an animal killed either a man or a woman, either a son or a daughter, either a male or a female slave. Both men and women had the same procedures regarding contagious diseases like leprosy. Over and over again, we see the law specifically say that the same laws apply to both men and women. Now, there are some passages in the law that seem to suggest a secondary role or that seem unfair to women. Let's take a look at a few of those, though. In one place in Deuteronomy, in a section on waging war, Israelite men are permitted to marry prisoners of war. Here's that passage. When you go to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home, have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. Now, the head shaving, the nail trimming, and the clothes burning, it's all meant to represent her leaving her past behind her and joining the people of Israel. It's unclear whether or not she'd have a choice in the matter, but let's keep in mind that women didn't have a lot of options back then. The patriarchy had designed society so that women were utterly dependent upon men. Back then, it was better to be married to your former enemy than to be on your own. What's more, the man was held accountable for how he treated her. The law goes on to say, if you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Now that's putting it pretty plainly. If you decide to end the marriage, she's a free woman and you have zero claim on her. Why? Because, and I quote, you have dishonored her. Though backward by today's standards, in its time, this law protected women. More specifically, extended grace to women from enemy nations who might otherwise have been enslaved or executed. Here's another one that seems unfair to women. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. So if a man had relations in a town with a woman who was engaged or married to someone else, they were both to be executed. The rationale was that if it were non-consensual, the woman would have called out for help. Now, it's not a perfect rule, but it was meant to guard against false accusations. On the other hand, outside of town, where there's no one around to hear, guess who was given the benefit of the doubt? The woman. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor, for the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her. This law was a sincere, if not perfect, effort to protect both women and men. But what if the woman were neither married nor engaged? If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Now, this doesn't seem right to our modern sensibilities, but keep historical and cultural context in mind. Unlike today, a woman had no other options back then. She had to get married to survive. If she got pregnant, she'd be alone with a child to take care of. And no man would be likely to marry her back then because the paternity of her first child might be in question. They didn't have paternity tests back then. In this scenario, if the man wanted the woman so badly, he could have just married her. But instead, he chose to take what he wanted from her without any of the responsibilities that come with being a husband. Once again, though this seems backward to us today, back then this law would have protected women from being abandoned by selfish men. There's one more Old Testament law that appears unfair to women, and I had to really research this one to make sense of it. If a man takes a wife and after sleeping with her dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, "I married this woman, but when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity," then the young woman's father and mother shall bring to the town elders at the gate proof that she was a virgin. And how would they do that, you might ask? Well, maybe not how you think. Remember, the reason virginity was such a big deal was because knowing the paternity of a child was a big deal. No paternity tests back then. Essentially, what the woman and her family are proving is that she's not pregnant. And young women, I think most of us know, get a monthly reminder that they aren't pregnant. So if the family could provide evidence that this monthly event had taken place, well, once again, the woman received the benefit of the doubt. And there were consequences for the accusing husband if the family could prove that the wife wasn't pregnant. Her father will say to the elders, "I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, 'I did not find your daughter to be a virgin.' But here is proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives." Although I have to kind of wonder what was waiting for him at home after that accusation in public. But once again, laws appear to us to be unfair to women, but back then they were actually intended to protect them from being victimized by men. Needless to say, these specific laws don't apply to us today. Women have other options, at least in our culture here. They're not as dependent upon men as they used to be. But the underlying principles are eternal. Women are not to be victimized. They are not here merely for the pleasure of men. They have rights and they have dignity, and men should be held accountable for the way that they treat women. But there are even laws in the Old Testament that treat women exceptionally well. Take a look at this one. If a man has recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year, he is to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he has married. Not much commentary necessary on that one. What about this one? If a husband died childless, his brother was required to marry the widow. Again, this is a provision to prevent a woman from being abandoned. And you know what happened if her brother-in-law refused to marry the widow? His brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, "This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled." And finally, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite Old Testament girl power moments. The daughters of Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, belonged to the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came forward and stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the elders, and the whole assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's fathers who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives." So Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter." This is a 3,500-year-old law. And as recently as 100 years ago, a daughter couldn't inherit her father's property in England. This is what I'm talking about the Old Testament being so progressive for its time when it came to the role of women. In the Old Testament, so often seen as backward and cruel and sexist, there were laws intended to protect women from being abandoned or victimized by men. The God of the Old Testament is not misogynist, as Dr. Hawkins suggests. No, he does not hate women. They are his daughters. He wants to protect them, and that remains true even today in the era of the New Testament. But God wants to do so much more than merely protect women. He wants to use them in powerful ways, just like he does men. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll be shining a spotlight on some of the great heroines of the Bible and the early years of the church.